we're in a lot of trouble. Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And when the 12th largest company in the world controls the most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world, who knows what shit will be peddled for truth on this network? Television is a goddamn amusement park. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We're in the boredom-killing business. So if you want the truth, go to yourselves, because that's the only place you're ever going to find any real truth. But man, you're never going to get any truth from us. We'll tell you anything you want to hear. We lie like hell. We'll tell you that no matter how much trouble the hero is in, don't worry, just look at your watch. At the end of the hour, he's going to win. We'll tell you any shit you want to hear. We deal in illusions, man. None of it is true. But you people, you're beginning to believe the illusions we're spinning here. You're beginning to think that the tube is reality and that your own lives are unreal. You do whatever the tube tells you. You dress like the tube. You eat like the tube. You raise your children like the tube. You even think like the tube. This is mass madness, you maniacs. In God's name, you people are the real thing. We are the illusion.
So I'm going to now move on into the 6th dynasty. Now, let's remember that I said that the 5th dynasty, there were signs that the pharaohs were being weakened, that their power was being weakened. And I theorize that this is because they overworked the Egyptian people while building the pyramids. And the Egyptian people became disillusioned with their pharaohs. So in the 6th dynasty, it's confirmed. And remember, the 5th dynasty was a rather short dynasty when you consider the lengths of the other dynasties. So like the 6th dynasty is actually like twice as long as the 5th dynasty. So this is what Wikipedia says about the 6th dynasty. It says, during the 6th dynasty, the power of Pharaoh gradually weakened in favor of powerful nomarchs, regional governors. These no longer belonged to the royal family and their charge became hereditary. I don't believe for a second that these governors didn't belong to the royal family. Maybe they didn't belong to the royal family like in a control-wise, like the royal family didn't have ownership of them. But I'm sure these royal governors were all related to the royal family in one way or another, just as they are today. So, going back, it says in the 6th dynasty, Nile flood control was still the subject of very large works, including especially the canal to Lake Moeris around 2300 BC, which was likely also the source of water to the Giza pyramid complex centuries earlier. It goes on to say that there were internal disorders set in during the incredibly long reign of Pepi II. He ruled for a pretty long time, man. This guy ruled for close to 100 years. Jesus, from 2278 to 2184. His death, certainly well past that of his intended heirs, might have created secession struggles. The country slipped into civil wars mere decades after the close of Pepi II's reign. See, I think that this is just more deception. I think that what really happened here is their gig was up. You know, the show was over. Pepi II, he tried reviving the pharaohhood. He had an incredibly long reign. And essentially, people became disillusioned. So the elite, they were like, okay, we got to pull the plug on this bad boy. Let's just start civil wars. Let's just start wars. Let's kill off as many people as possible. Let's make it appear like they're legitimate wars. And this is precisely what we see today. And I'm going to go into that later on when we get to the modern era. But that's exactly what's happening here. These civil wars, it's just all a show. It's all deception. They're just trying to kill people off. So then it goes on to say the final blow was the 22nd century BC drought in the region that resulted in a drastic drop in precipitation. For at least some years between 2200 and 2150 BC, this prevented the normal flooding of the Nile. Whatever its cause, the collapse of the Old Kingdom was followed by decades of famine and strife. An important inscription on the tomb of a nomarch during the early First Intermediate period described the pitiful state of the country when famine stalked the land. So the First Intermediate period, those are the periods in between the different kingdoms. So we're in the Old Kingdom, the next kingdom is the Middle Kingdom. This sixth dynasty is the end of the Old Kingdom. This is the end of what was happening. The elite had to pull the plug, and that's actually what I think is happening here. This drought, this loss of precipitation, these elite, they did this. I believe that they were fully responsible for this. They either did something to the irrigation system that prevented the normal flooding of the Nile, and it made it appear like there was a drop in precipitation. They could have built a dam somewhere. They could have dammed it up. I'm sure that with this theory, if you were actually to go along the Nile and maybe look for evidence of this, I'm sure you would find it. And then, of course, the famine and strife. This is all orchestrated. Okay, think about it as like Ra's al Ghul and Batman. You know, they gotta shut down this system and reboot up another one. That's the end of the Sixth Dynasty. There's not really much to note. I'm not going to go over many of the pharaohs in the Sixth Dynasty. It's important to know, though, that if you go through all of these pharaohs in the Old Kingdom, they are all related in some way or another. What you do is go to the first pharaoh, and then at the side of Wikipedia, you're going to see that it will actually say like who succeeded this person and who preceded this person. And you can go through each and every one of them and read their Wikipedia, and you will find that they are all related in one way or another. Now let's move on to the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom. I believe the Middle Kingdom should be called the Mirror Kingdom. Why do I think it should be called the Mirror Kingdom? Well, because it's kind of a trope that mirrors are used to deceive people in magic, and I feel like the Middle Kingdom is just chock full of deception. And I say this because, as you will see, it appears that in the Middle Kingdom, they attempted to restart their plan, and by they I mean the elite, the club. It appears that they tried to restart their plan under a new alias. It seems like they tried to restart their plan under the guise that they actually just defeated the evils of the previous kingdom. Now, allow me to provide evidence for this, first slowly and then more drastically. So the Middle Kingdom, if you go over to Wikipedia, which is where I got all my information, I know people can be like, oh, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. Well, it is when Wikipedia has reliable sources sourced on their page. Now, if there's no source, then yeah, it's not reliable. But for the most part, Wikipedia sources their material here, and they do have moderators who go around and make sure there isn't fake information being posted on stuff. So please try not to provide this erroneous argument that Wikipedia isn't a reliable source simply because your indoctrinators at your public schools told you that it wasn't a reliable source. So anyway, it says, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, also known as the period of reunification. During the Middle Kingdom period, Osiris became the most important deity in popular religion. I don't know exactly what the most popular deity in the Old Kingdom was. I don't believe it said it anywhere. There was just like a group of popular ones. But in this one, Osiris really became the most popular. He was like, we can say hands down, he was the most popular. And I've already gone over Osiris. He is a moon deity. But there's an interesting thing that I didn't talk about before about Osiris. And here, if you go to Wikipedia and you look through Osiris, it briefly mentions Horus and Osiris, as it should, because Osiris is supposed to be the father of Horus. But here it says, Horus became thought of as a representation of new beginnings and the vanquisher of the evil set. So this is what I sort of just said, that they were trying to make it as if this new kingdom was the vanquisher of the previous evils. I'm pretty confident of this. It's just a theory. There's not total evidence for it, it's just a theory of mine. And the deception, the fact that this royal cult pretty much just came back into power just under a different alias, is very revealing when we look at the reunification under the 11th dynasty and the other events that take place during the 11th dynasty. So, Mentuhotep II commended military campaigns as far as the Second Cataract in Nubia, which had gained its independence during the First Intermediate period. All right, imperialism. That's the good old-fashioned American way. Yep, they still do that today. You want your independence? Well, guess what? Not going to happen. We're going to send our military in there, and we're going to force you to stay with us. Insanity. But anyway, so it goes on to say, to consolidate his authority, Mentuhotep II restored the cult of the ruler, depicting himself as a god in his own lifetime. All right, there you go. He even restored the cult, okay? That means this cult had gone underground and it had to be restored, okay? Just more proof of deception. So he died. He died after a reign of 51 years, rather long reign. I'm sure that pissed off the people, and I'm sure that they had to do a little bit more deception for that. Mentuhotep III reigned for only 12 years, and there's a lot of symbolism here. So during which he continued consolidating Theban rule over the whole of Egypt, building a series of forts in the eastern delta, and etc., etc. So what else happened in the 11th dynasty? So Mentuhotep III was succeeded by Mentuhotep IV, whose name significantly is omitted from all ancient Egyptian kings list. However, there is he probably was omitted because, look at him over here, bowing to the boner. He's the one on the right. I'm sure that the one on the left is a cult member, and, he's just showing that, yes, I serve the cult. I serve the great boner god, the great phallus god, I serve you. But I'm sorry, enough of the humor. We don't have time for that. So he's omitted from the king's list, and there's a papyrus that claims that after Mentuhotep III came 7 kingless years. Very interesting. They just love their numbers. So despite his absence, his reign is attested from in a few inscriptions that there are inscriptions about their expeditions to the Red Sea coast to quarry stone. So we know this guy existed. He was just omitted from the king's list, and we're going to see why. So the leader of this expedition was his viceroy, Amenemhat, who is widely assumed to be the future pharaoh Amenemhat I, the first king of the 12th dynasty, or the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. So right there, I just want everyone to know this viceroy position is the same position that Amenhotep occupied. The viceroy appears to be the position that the cult occupied. They also occupied the pharaohhood when they were really in power, but when they weren't in power, they were just put into the viceroy position. So his viceroy became pharaoh. Okay, that tells us a lot. That tells us that, okay, this cult is now back in power. And then Wikipedia goes on to say that Mentuhotep IV's absence from the king's list has prompted the theory that Amenemhat I usurped his throne. While there are no contemporary accounts of this struggle, certain circumstantial evidence may point to the existence of a civil war at the end of the 11th dynasty. I don't think so. I think that there is a civil war. I think that it was passed on just like it was supposed to. It was all a setup. This is why there actually is no contemporary accounts of this struggle. There's just certain circumstantial evidence. So inscriptions left by this guy suggest that he was attacked at a place called Shabutu Shah by the forces of the reigning king, but his forces prevailed. Then Khnumhotep I, an official under Amenemhat I, claims to have participated in a flotilla of 20 ships to pacify Upper Egypt. So there, I guess this is the circumstantial evidence, but the thing is, as I said, the first Amenhotep, he was around for 51 years. So maybe people were getting pissed off, and maybe they needed to kind of create this illusion, like, oh no guys, it's okay, but we're going to pacify you guys up here, don't worry, we got this guy out of office, you guys are pissed off. So this is probably actually why it looks like this, where there doesn't seem to be a struggle, but yet it also kind of seems like there was a civil war, because there was probably an uprising, and they probably suppressed the uprising by pretending to overthrow or usurp the throne, when really it's just the cult ruling. It goes on to say that these events should be interpreted as evidence of open war between two dynastic claimants. What is certain is that, however he came to power, Amenemhat I was not of royal birth. This is a little important, and I'll explain to you why, and we're actually going to see why. It's actually very interesting. I even believe, and I'll say this, that history really repeats itself. You're going to see, this guy was pretty much the Obama of his time. To every detail. This pharaoh is actually, you're going to see, he's a black pharaoh. A black pharaoh that came with the idea of hope and change. It is just too unreal. I hope that you're all enjoying this video right now. I really do. Because I know I am. It's just hilarious to me because it really shows all of this repeating of history and this obsession, this schizophrenic obsession with numbers. It shows that these people, these elite, they're not very smart. They're not very original because they're not very smart. Let's look at Amenemhep I. Remember, Amenemhep I is the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. So we're going to look at the early 12th dynasty. And Wikipedia says this about the 12th dynasty. From the 12th dynasty onwards, pharaohs often kept well-trained standing armies. I'm sorry, I just have to laugh because it just can't get any more unreal, which included Nubian contingents. And for those of you who don't know who the Nubians are essentially the people from Sudan. They're like ancient people from Sudan, and I believe that they were used in the Egyptian army or the Egyptian standing army precisely because they were not Egyptian, because they were foreigners, so they can be used against the domestic population without having to worry about them feeling sympathy for the domestic population. The Nubians also have an interesting history, a long-standing history with ancient Egypt. If you go and you look at their Wikipedia page, it actually says that Nubia was actually like almost always a part of dynastic Egypt, and it was one of the first nomes. And remember, the nomes came about in the 6th dynasty when it appears like the pharaohs were trying to decentralize or disperse the negative feedback coming their way from them enslaving the Egyptian people in the 4th and 5th dynasty. And then Wikipedia goes on to say that those formed the basis, the standing armies and the Nubian contingents, formed the basis of larger forces which were raised for defense against invasion. I think that Wikipedia has it wrong here. I think historians have it wrong here. I think that they were raised for defense against inner turmoil and uprisings. And then it goes on to say, or for expeditions up the Nile or across the Sinai Peninsula. And this is actually going to come into handy later. The fact that these standing armies were raised for expeditions, or basically, as you will see, imperialism. And then it goes on to say how the Middle Kingdom was just defensive, and how it just like fortified the Nile and the Delta, and that, they weren't going around being aggressive or anything like that. Even though I would argue otherwise, and you're going to see evidence for why I believe that they actually did use this army for imperialistic purposes. Now, going back to Amenemhep's Wikipedia, it says this about it. I'm not going to go over his whole Wikipedia, as I said, and I will continue to say as I go through this. It says this about him, which I found very interesting. Like Mentuhotep II, Amenemhet bolstered his claim to authority with propaganda. Oh, really? Really? You don't say? A lot like they do today? Goes on to say, in particular, the prophecy of Neferti dates to about this time, which purports to be an oracle of an Old Kingdom priest who predicts a king, Amenemhep I, arising from the far south of Egypt to restore the kingdom after centuries of chaos. And while we're on the topic of propaganda, I'm just going to share with you the propaganda that Mentuhotep II used to bolster his claim to power. And I want to go over this propaganda because it sort of reminds me of Abraham. Remember, Queen Elizabeth is supposedly related to Abraham, and I'll be talking about Abraham and the pharaoh that is apparently associated with Abraham in another part of this documentary. Actually, I believe in the next part of this documentary. But right now, I'm going to make another connection to Abraham that wasn't made before, and it's made in this propaganda. So the propaganda that Mentuhotep II used to bolster his claim to power comes from the fictional character of Mentuhotep I. We have to remember, Mentuhotep II was the first ruler in the Middle Kingdom, or what can be deemed the Middle Kingdom, or the first ruler of the 11th dynasty. However, why was he called Mentuhotep II and not Mentuhotep I? It kind of leaves out Mentuhotep I. So I did some research to find Mentuhotep I, and this is what it says about Mentuhotep I. So it says that he was likely a Theban nomarch and independent ruler of Upper Egypt during the First Intermediate Period. He was later probably considered to be the founding father of the 11th dynasty, which rose to prominence under Entef II and Mentuhotep II. So the thing is, as you can see with the language here, it says was likely and probably considered. So it means that they don't really know. And this is what it says further on. Later on, in his identity, it says this under it. So it says, it says a couple of other things. It talks about how he was put on the king's list well after his death. That it appears like Mentuhotep II or Mentuhotep III is the one who put him on the king's list. And they did it in a very suspicious way. It goes on and it says this in his identity. I highlighted this. I'm not going to go through everything else because I'm trying to make this quick. So it says this. It says, the fact that Mentuhotep I is not actually attested on any contemporary monument has led some Egyptologists to propose that he is a fictional ancestor and founder of the 11th dynasty, invented for that purpose during the later part of the dynasty. So in other words, they created this fake story about this guy that people would worship, and then they said that they were related to him. And this is essentially, if you look up Abraham of the Bible, you find this in Abraham of the Bible. The Abraham story cannot be definitively related to any specific time, and it is widely agreed that the patriarchal age, along with the Exodus and the period of the Judges, is a late literary construct that does not relate to any period in actual history. A common hypothesis among scholars is that it was composed in the early Persian period, late 6th century BCE, as a result of tensions between Jewish landowners who had stayed in Judah during the Babylonian captivity and traced their right to the land through their, quote, father Abraham, unquote, and the returning exiles who based their counterclaim on Moses and the Exodus tradition. So essentially it's just saying here that the story of Abraham was created to try to bolster people's claim to land that other people were also trying to claim. And this is pretty much exactly like what they did with Mentuhotep I. They used Mentuhotep I, a fictional character, as a work of propaganda to bolster their claim to power. And this is exactly what Queen Elizabeth and the other royal families are doing when they try to relate themselves to this fictional Abraham. And we can find evidence of this in this article titled Queen Elizabeth II, A Daughter of Destiny, Hope of Israel Ministries. And it can be found at hopeofisrael.org. And this article says pretty much what has been stated in this documentary so far. And I'm just going to read this first. So it says, the monarchy and the throne of Great Britain are part of a divinely ordained royal succession that is descended from the scepter-holding line of Judah and the royal throne of David. The evidence of this can be traced as far back as Abraham, but this article will concentrate on later evidence, including that from England's coronation service. So this is exactly, as I said just before, what Queen Elizabeth and the other royal families used to bolster their claim to power. This is what they use to claim their divine right. But they don't have any divine right. It's all just propaganda. And as I said before in my previous part of this documentary, this really goes to show how stupid these people are. They are just so unoriginal. They have been using practically the same propaganda for thousands of years. Okay, they are not intelligent. And honestly, it's not that we're stupid and unable to see it. It's just that they try so hard to dumb us down to be on their level. They can only rule us when they handicap us. I mean, they really are this stupid. So I'm just going to move back now to Amenemhet I. And here's a statue of Amenemhet I. He's a black guy, okay? Don't say, oh no, they're just depicting him as black. No, he was a black guy, okay? There's absolutely no doubt of that whatsoever, especially since he used Nubian contingents in his army, and the Nubians are black also. And there's nothing wrong with being black, just pointing it out, just pointing out the facts, okay? And then Wikipedia goes on to say, propaganda notwithstanding, Amenemhet never held the absolute power commanded in theory by the Old Kingdom pharaohs. During the first intermediate period, the governors of the nomes of Egypt, nomarchs, gained considerable power. Their post had become hereditary, and some nomarchs entered into marriage alliances with the nomarchs of neighboring nomes. To strengthen his position, Amenemhet required registration of land, modified nome borders, and appointed nomarchs directly when offices became vacant, but acquiesced to the nomarch system, probably in order to placate the nomarchs who supported his rule. This gave the Middle Kingdom a more feudal organization than Egypt had before or would have afterward. See, I don't know if this is like a ruse going on here, but it does seem that he began to turn against the cult. I don't think he really did, but let's see where this goes. So, in his 20th regional year, Amenemhet established his son Senusret I as his corregent, establishing a practice which would be used repeatedly throughout the rest of the Middle Kingdom and again during the New Kingdom. In Amenemhet's 30th regional year, he was presumably murdered in a palace conspiracy. This is interesting, the language here. Presumably murdered in a palace conspiracy. I mean, maybe he was. That's possible. Maybe he really was turning against them, and they got pissed off, and they were like, "Hey, man, you're screwing stuff up. You're messing up what the club had established." So his son, Senusret I, campaigning against Libyan invaders, rushed home to this place to prevent a takeover of the government. Very interesting. I don't understand how this would have happened during this time period when it's not like they had cell phones. See, this is what I mean. This doesn't make any sense to me. This is why I sort of question him actually turning against them, because it's like, okay, your father was killed. I mean, this guy, he was campaigning against Libyan invaders. Information didn't travel that fast. It's not like they can communicate via the mind. It's not like his father died and he was like, "Oh, my father died. I can just tell that father and son bond. It's been broken. I must rush home and prevent a takeover of the government." So this, I don't know. But I mean, that's just me questioning stuff. It could have happened. It could have happened. Let's pretend it happened this way, okay? Because even if it did happen this way, you're going to see it's not really going to matter. So, during his reign, he continued the practice of directly appointing nomarchs and undercut the autonomy of local priesthoods by building at cult centers throughout Egypt. So he went around and he started constructing at the cult centers. What I think happened here actually was it's possible that they were trying to make it as if they were destroying this cult. That this cult actually turned against them while they were trying to destroy them, and that they went and they took care of it. They stomped it out. There's nothing to worry about. And it seems like this is what Trump is doing. And it's false, and it's just a repeat of history. And it's very interesting that Obama, this guy's father, and now this guy, it seems like he has a parallel with Trump. So it's so interesting how history repeats itself. So let's look at his son, Amenemhet II. So the third pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. So his son, interesting things about him. I'm just going to kind of skip to the point. It does not appear that Amenemhet II continued his predecessor's policy of appointing nomarchs, but let it become hereditary again. Very interesting. So in his 33rd regional year, he appointed his son, Senusret II. And there isn't much on Senusret II, but Senusret III is a very interesting person. So Senusret III, if you check out his Wikipedia, he's regarded as one of the sources, I mean, that means that there's multiple sources, he's regarded as one of the sources for the legend about Sesostris. So who's Sesostris? Well, in order to find out that, we have to go and look at the account of Herodotus. And according to this guy who calls him Seseusis and Strobo, he conquered the whole world, even Scythia and Ethiopia, divided Egypt into administrative districts or nomes, was a great lawgiver, and introduced a caste system into Egypt and the worship of Serapis. Now, I just want to clarify this. Senusret III is not Senostris. He is one of the sources for Senostris. And based off of this legend, it sounds like this guy Senostris, or Seseusis, existed in the Old Kingdom. Or it's even possible that he could have existed before the Old Kingdom. Because remember, the Old Kingdom was apparently when Egypt was unified, and before that, it was these different districts. So it's very possible that there was a kingdom before the Old Kingdom. And this is somewhat confirmed by this claim that he introduced a caste system into Egypt and the worship of Serapis, two things that already existed before the Old Kingdom. And for the sake of clarity, let's take a closer look at who this Serapis is. So according to Wikipedia, the cult of Serapis was introduced during the 3rd century BC on the orders of Ptolemy I of Egypt, as a means to unify the Greeks and Egyptians in his realm. The god was depicted as Greek in appearance, but with Egyptian trappings and combined iconography from a great many cults, signifying both abundance and resurrection. See, there was a lot of resurrection cults before Jesus Christ. And this is precisely why I believe Jesus Christ is just another incarnation of these cults. He's just another level deeper in their deception. They had to create a new hero that was a little bit more appealing for the general population at the time. a new cult or a new public figure that would pacify the rebellious masses. See, people aren't stupid. They were catching on to what's happening, and that's why they had to keep changing stuff up and make it like the previous bad guys were usurped or were taken care of. And Jesus Christ is just the ultimate representation of this. I mean, come on, he died for everyone's sins. I mean, he's like the ultimate savior figure. So he's the ultimate figure to pacify people. And I believe that Jesus Christ chasing the Jewish moneylenders out of Jerusalem is very revealing as to who the bad guys were, who the general population were beginning to rebel against. And we'll be talking about that later on in this video when we get to the Jewish question. So back to Serapis. So Serapis was also regarded as a healer, just like Jesus. But anyway, I digress from Jesus. The interesting thing, though, is here in that Wikipedia, although it says that the cult of Serapis was established by Ptolemy I of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, it goes on to say that, however, there is evidence which implies that the cult of Serapis existed before Ptolemies came to power in Alexandria. And then kind of gives evidence to that. Well, of course the cult of Serapis existed before the 3rd century BC. It existed well before the 3rd century BC. Serapis is also depicted as a snake. He's depicted hand in hand with the snake. And of course, Serapis, meaning serpent, is related to Uraeus, or Urius. And Urius, it stands for on its tail, or rearing cobra, and it is the stylized upright form of an Egyptian cobra, used as a symbol of sovereignty, royalty, deity, and divine authority in ancient Egypt. The symbolism comes from the goddess Wajet. She was one of the earliest Egyptian deities, and was often depicted as a cobra. So there you have it. This snake cult existed well before the cult of Serapis. The snake cult existed before the Old Kingdom. It's one of Egypt's oldest deities, and that's before Egypt was even unified. Now, the reason why I am attempting to interpret this legend of Senostris as taking place before the Old Kingdom is because of this part of the legend. If you read the rest of this, Herodotus also relates that when Cesarus defeated an army without much resistance, he erected a pillar in their capital with a vagina on it to symbolize the fact that the army fought like women. Do these pillars ring any bells? Well, they should be, because these pillars in question are actually obelisks, and there are obelisks in many capitals throughout the world, including the obelisk that we talked about earlier in the video, the obelisk in the city of London, or the capital of Great Britain, the obelisk in Washington, D.C., or the capital of the United States, and there are obelisks all around Rome, the capital of Italy, and especially the well-known obelisk in the Vatican. Yes, that's right. I believe that these pillars, these obelisks that are erected in many capitals throughout the world, are a sign of defeat. They're a sign that that place has been conquered. And rest assured, where all of these obelisks are, the club has conquered. And not only have they conquered, but they conquered these places with ease. They faced little to no resistance. However, it should be noted, and because I'm an honest person, I will note, that the accounts of Herodotus are not without criticism. According to Wikipedia, the reliability of Herodotus is sometimes criticized when writing about Egypt. I wonder why. Was he speaking a little bit too truthfully about Egypt? No, it couldn't be that, right? It goes on to say, Alan B. Lloyd argues that, as a historical document, the writings of Herodotus are seriously defective, and that he was working from inadequate sources. Nielsen writes, though we cannot entirely rule out the possibility of Herodotus having been in Egypt, it must be said that his narrative bears little witness to it. German historian Detlev Fehling questions whether Herodotus ever traveled up the Nile River, and considers doubtfully almost everything that he says about Egypt and Ethiopia. Fehling states that, quote, there is not the slightest bit of history behind the whole story, about the claim of Herodotus that Pharaoh Sesostris campaigned in Europe and that he left a colony in Colchia. And maybe these scholars and historians are correct, But maybe they're not correct. Maybe they're just slightly correct, and this would explain the inaccuracy of Herodotus's account. Because I've already said that I believe what Herodotus was talking about here happened much earlier than anyone could imagine, that it happened before the Old Kingdom. And later on, when I look at the prehistoric history of Egypt, when I look to see if I can discover where this cult originated from, you're going to see that yes, I believe this cult did conquer the world before establishing themselves in Egypt. But for now, let's see if we can prove Herodotus correct by looking at Colchia. So Colchia, also known as Colchis, was an ancient kingdom and region on the coast of the Black Sea, centered in present-day western Georgia. It has been described in modern scholarship as, quote, the earliest Georgian formation, which, along with the kingdom of Iberia, would later contribute significantly to the development of the medieval Georgian statehood and the Georgian nation. So Kolkia is where the civilization of Georgia started, or the Georgian statehood started, and it was supposedly colonized by one of the earliest civilizations. I see that as very interesting. And for those who don't know where Georgia is geographically, I took the time to capture this screenshot from Google Earth. So there goes Egypt at the bottom left, and there goes Georgia at the top right. And I even took the time to measure the distance. And for those of you who can't see the distance, this straight line distance is a little over 1,000 miles. And I also find it very interesting that they would colonize this area here in Georgia. If you notice, that's actually where the land bottlenecks. It's a very strategic position if you want to control trade routes. And the most important thing traded along trade routes is information. So as you see, in Egypt, they would have controlled the trade route from Africa to the Middle East, and then by colonizing Georgia, they would have controlled the trade route from the Middle East into Asia and Europe in that direction. And as we discussed earlier in the video, those tunnels from Turkey to Scotland. So Turkey is another bottleneck area. Very interesting, very calculated, very strategic. But we're just observing right now. Let's see what other secrets are hidden in the history of Colchia. Internationally, Colchis is perhaps best known for its role in Greek mythology, most notably as the destination of the Argonauts, as well as the home to Medea and the Golden Fleece. It was also described as a land rich with gold, iron, timber, and honey that would export its resources mostly to ancient Greece. And I believe I've already linked ancient Greek mythology to ancient Egyptian mythology when we talked about the link between Serapis and Eurus. And I'm pretty sure even the most mainstream scholars would agree with me that the ancient Egyptians had a huge impact or a huge influence on ancient Greek mythology. And it really isn't that out of the question to suggest that the ancient Egyptians covertly colonized or covertly seated themselves in ancient Greece when we look at how close the two are, and when we consider that the ancient Greeks did have boats, with sails on them by the way. Provide a little map for those who are geographically ignorant, and here at the bottom center, and Greece at the top left. And it's very interesting because when you link up Egypt to Greece, and Greece to Georgia, and then back to Egypt, it sort of makes an interesting triangle shape. And in this case, the ancient Egyptians, or at least this cult that ruled ancient Egypt, would have really controlled a lot of the trade in this area. Specifically, the trade in information, which would explain why both the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greek had a polytheistic belief system. But anyway, let's go back to Colchia, or Colchis. So Colchis, once again it said this, Colchis is perhaps best known for its role in Greek mythology, most notably as the destination of the Argonauts. Let's look at who the Argonauts were. So the Argonauts were a band of heroes in Greek mythology who in the years before the Trojan War, around 1300 BC, accompanied Jason to Colchis in his quest to find the Golden Fleece. Their name comes from their ship, Argo, named after its builder, Argus. Argonauts literally means Argo sailors. They were sometimes called minions after a prehistoric tribe in the area. This too I find very interesting because some of the first sailors were the ancient Egyptians. As you see here, the ancient Egyptians had sailboats by the year 3000 BC. The very first sailors were the ancient Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, and we're going to be looking at them and their link to the cult later on in this documentary. For now, let's look at the other name that these Argonauts were called, the Minions, who were supposedly a prehistoric tribe in the area. So according to Wikipedia, the Minions were an autochthonous group inhabiting the Aegean region. Essentially, I bring this up because autochthonous, it means people sprung from the earth itself. It means the original inhabitants of a country as opposed to settlers. So the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they saw the Minions, or the Argonauts, as the original inhabitants of this area. So it's my theory that the ancient Greeks perceived these people as autochthonous because, or as the original inhabitants, because the Egyptians, or this cult, maybe not even the Egyptians, but this cult that gave the knowledge of boats and stuff to the Egyptians and Sumerians, well actually this cult didn't give the knowledge to the Sumerians. I'll go over that in another part of this documentary. I believe the Sumerians gave the knowledge of boats to this cult, and that's why this cult quickly took over the Sumerians. But that information is for another part of this documentary. So, as I was saying though, I believe that the ancient Greeks perceived the Argonauts, or the Minions, as the native inhabitants because those native inhabitants had been conquered by the cult so long before the ancient Greeks had interacted with them. Or put in another way, that cult had colonized that area so long before the ancient Greeks had interacted with them. And honestly, all of this is actually pointless. I could have proved the account of Herodotus another way by saying Herodotus is only one source for this pharaoh who conquered the world. We have to remember that the other source for this pharaoh who conquered the world was Senusret III. So it doesn't matter if Herodotus is wrong. There are other people long before Herodotus who claimed the same things that Herodotus claimed. So I think that these experts, these other archaeologists who claim that Herodotus was right about everything else but wrong about ancient Egypt, I think that they're just trying to cover up their trail. I think that they're just trying to cover up history and trying to make people not realize that this royal cult conquered the world a long time ago. Okay, the New World Order, it has been established for a long time now. And I would ask them, okay, if you're going to say that Herodotus is wrong, what about the other people who claimed the same things that he claimed? What about this pharaoh who claimed the same thing that he claimed over 1,000 years before he claimed it? So anyway, quickly returning back to Senusret, it says, domestically, Senusret has been given credit for administrative reform which put more power in the hands of appointees of the central government instead of regional authorities. Egypt was divided into 3 waret, or administrative divisions, north, south, and head of the south, perhaps Lower Egypt, most of Upper Egypt, and the nomes of the regional Theban kingdom during the war with Heraclopos, respectively. Anyway, each region was administrated by a reporter, second reporter, some kind of council, and a staff of minor officials and scribes. So what I think is happening here when they're creating all these divisions is I think that they're setting up to diminish their responsibility. They're creating more plausible deniability. Now, when they do this, they can say, oh, it's not this guy's fault, it's that guy's fault. Oh, it's not my fault, no, it's this other guy's fault. And nobody can actually be held accountable for the negative actions. And this is very much like what they do in our current system. You know, they like having this supposed system of checks and balances. There are no checks and balances, okay? What it is just them dividing their responsibility. So now it's like, oh no, it's not these representatives' faults, it's those representatives' faults. It's not this party's fault, it's that party's fault. And then it's just the left and right march of tyranny. And this was the whole purpose of this system. And actually, it would be much better to have a king because then at least people would be able to know who's accountable for the negative actions. You know, you can have a king with then a set restriction of that king's power and then a bill of rights to the people. And you know, I'm not really advocating a kinghood or a monarchy. I'm just saying that it would actually be better than our current system because then we would actually know who to go to and blame for the things that go wrong. And then it goes on to say, the power of the nomarchs seemed to drop off permanently during his reign, which has been taken to indicate that the central government had finally suppressed them, though there is no record that Sinistret ever took direct action against them. See, I think that they just fell in line. They just fell over and they obeyed. And I think it's also because they knew that they didn't want to be the ones responsible or on the chopping block when the shit that was hitting the fan was about to hit the fan. And there's evidence for this shit hitting the fan. Later on, when it starts to talk about the fall into the next intermediate period, it says, contemporary records of the Nile flood levels indicate that the end of the reign of Amenemhet III was dry and crop failure may have helped to destabilize the dynasty. So right before Sinistret started to create all these divisions and stuff, the Nile flood levels were having some problems, and there was some major crop failures happening. And it could be that they were responsible for this. I theorize that they were responsible for the crop failures and the drying of the Nile in the first intermediate period. I think that they did something to the irrigation system to cause that, but that can't really be proven. It could have been a natural thing, and since these pharaohs were considered gods who can control stuff, they knew that, hey, they're going to come at us if the Nile doesn't flood like it's supposed to flood. That's the problem with their position and with the lies that they weaved. If they're claiming to be responsible for the flooding of the Nile, well, guess what? When the Nile doesn't flood, guess who's responsible for that? The pharaohs. So this is also why they had to divide stuff up. They had to disperse the responsibility, and this is also why the pharaohs kind of fell out of power towards the end of the First Kingdom. Remember, at the end of the First Kingdom, it was like the 5th dynasty where they had like the highest power, but then in the 6th dynasty, they began to, like, the power switched from the pharaohs to the nomarchs. And that's because they probably realized that the Nile wasn't flooding the way it was supposed to, so they wanted to quickly get out of the spotlight. They wanted to get out of the spotlight and put these other people in the spotlight and say, hey, look, these guys, they're not responsible for the flooding, so, you can't cut their heads off, but us pharaohs, we're going to get the hell out of here. And that's probably when the pharaohs, began to also see themselves in other parts of the world and began to change their story a little bit. They were learning because they're really stupid, so they actually had to learn this. They couldn't foresee that, hey, if we say we're responsible for the flooding of the Nile, people are going to hold us responsible for when the Nile doesn't flood. And you can actually tell that they didn't learn anything from this because even when they attempted to seed themselves in other parts of the world, they still claimed to be like representatives of God. And that's exactly why they lost power again, is because people said, wait a second, my prayers aren't being answered. The good things that I'm doing for the church aren't being reciprocated, and it made people lose faith. Just like when the Nile stopped flooding, people started to lose faith in the pharaoh. They started to say, wait a second, this guy doesn't actually control the flooding of the Nile, because if he did, the Nile would keep flooding. We're doing good things for them. So once again, this just shows how stupid the elite are. This just shows how unoriginal they are, and how incapable of learning they are. I mean, we really can't continue to allow ourselves to be ruled and to be tyrannized by such a moronic group. And one more piece of evidence that they were trying to shake things up is that after Senusret III, there was Amenemhet III, and then Amenemhet III had like a really long reign, and apparently that messed up like the succession. And then after Amenemhet IV, there was a female pharaoh, the first female pharaoh in Egypt, and I believe that they had this female pharaoh step onto the stage, not because there was a succession problem, but because there was a problem with the people catching on to them. So they said, hey, people like women. People are pretty easy on women, so let's put a female pharaoh in power. And then, of course, she ruled for no more than 4 years, and as she apparently had no heirs, when she died, the 12th dynasty came to a sudden end, and so did the Golden Age of the Middle Kingdom. See, I think the Golden Age of the Middle Kingdom was already coming to an end, and they just knew that, hey, it would be good to have a female there, because they're not going to chop her head off, and she can do something to preserve our cult. Anyway, I'm gonna just try to end the video here. The decline into the second intermediate period isn't that important, but it should be known that in the second intermediate period, there's just more juggling around. There's just a lot of deception in the second intermediate period. It's just like some people rise to power, but they're not in power for very long. All the rulers, they're not really in power for too long. They're just in power long enough to make it look like there's a shakeup going on, but there is no shakeup. When the second intermediate period ends, the club is still in power. They just tried shaking stuff up to make it look like they're not in power. And we're going to see that in the next part of this documentary when we look at the New Kingdom of Egypt. Advanced civilization is one and the same thing as arduous problems. Hence, the greater the progress, the greater danger it is in. Life gets gradually better, but evidently also gradually more complicated. Of course, as problems become more complex, the means of solving them also become more perfect. But each new generation must master these perfected means. Amongst them, to come to the concrete, there is one most plainly attached to the advance of a civilization, namely, that it have a great deal of the past at its back, a great deal of experience. In a word, history. Historical knowledge is a technique of the first order to preserve and continue a civilization already advanced. Not that it affords positive solutions to the new aspects of vital conditions, life is always different from what it was, but that it prevents us committing the ingenious mistakes of other times. But if, in addition to being old, and therefore beginning to find life difficult, you have lost the memory of the past and do not profit by experience, then everything turns to disadvantage.